Hey, welcome to the Press Box Chronicles with Jeff Pearlman. Hey, welcome to the Press Box Chronicles with Jeff Pearlman, the show where a cranky middle-aged sports writer who's seen it all, that is me, takes you behind the scenes and into the stories. I'm your host, Jeff Pearlman. And I was thinking about, if you watch a show, you might notice the mess behind me. And one of the things I have hanging on the mess, although I took it down for today, is this image. And this is former Yankee catcher Thurman Munson. And my dad, my late father, Stanley Pearlman, bought this for me when I was a kid, when we were walking through New York City past the old Daily News office building. And Thurman Munson, for a generation of sports fans, myself included, symbolized tragedy in sport, symbolized lost youth, symbolized sort of death before it should happen, death before it logically should happen. And for a generation of sports fans, in particular, a generation of New York sports fans like I was, Thurman Munson symbolized something. And recently, I actually received a message on our TikTok feed for this show from a viewer who asked me about Ken Hubbs. Can you talk about Ken Hubbs? Talk about the tragedy of Ken Hubbs. Talk about the hope of Ken Hubbs. And I'm going to be totally honest. I consider myself a sports guy, a sports expert, someone who's covered sports for many moons. I didn't know who in God's name Ken Hubbs was. And I immediately started researching and looking into it and thought, holy shit, Ken Hubbs is Thurman Munson for an earlier generation. And that's why today we're going to dive into the life and very tragic and premature death of former Cubs second baseman Ken Hubbs. Okay, so I'm going to assume if you're watching this show on any sort of modern technology, you probably, not definitely, but probably have never heard of Ken Hubbs. Ken Hubbs, born in Riverside, California, raised in Colton, California, born in 1941, a kid of the 1950s and 60s. And Ken Hubbs was your kid in tiny Colton, California, who was a do-everything athlete. In 1954, he was part of a Colton team that made the Little League World Series, made the final game of the Little League World Series. Ken Hubbs gained some early sort of notoriety in local newspapers because he broke his toe in his backyard messing around, played in the Little League World Series, pitched in the Little League World Series with an extra large shoe surrounding a cast on his toe. At Colton High School, he was a four-sport star. He was the LA Examiner's best all-around athlete for 1959. He was all-state in football, all-state in basketball, all-state in track. He was a first-string quarterback on the Sporting News All-American team. He was the Colton High School class president. He was ambidextrous. He pitched righty and lefty. He was all Southern section 2 years in a row in baseball and football. He was recruited by Notre Dame to play quarterback. UCLA expressed interest in him. John Wooden to play basketball. He was that athlete. And he was all prepared to either go to Stanford, USC, or BYU to play football and baseball when a Chicago Cubs scout named Gene Hanley came along and offered $50,000 to sign with the Cubs. And this is before the 1959 season. And back in the day, I mean, even now for some of us, $50,000 was a lot of money. But back in 1959, $50,000 was a shitload of money. And Ken Hubbs signs with the Cubs. And he is immediately assigned to the Class D Appalachian League, the Morristown Cubs, plays 59 games, 298, 8 homers, 50 RBIs, really good player. The next year, goes to camp with the Cubs. And it's really interesting. Ken Hubbs was signed as a shortstop. And he was a really, really good shortstop. I'm trying to think, he wasn't Ozzie Smith or Omar Vizquel, but he was definitely in the field a sort of a Kevin Elster type, Francisco Lindor type. Made all the plays, made some spectacular plays, a really, really good defensive shortstop. However, the Chicago Cubs, when Ken Hubbs arrived, have a shortstop named Ernie Banks. So in 1960, Ken Hubbs is moved by the Cubs to second base. And that year, playing for the Double-A Wanatchee Chiefs, he hits 286, 9 homers, 20 doubles, only makes 9 errors all season at second base. And he's just a legit prospect. He can play. He can do everything. He can hit with a little pop. Everything that's hit to him, he fields. And at the end of 1961, the Chicago Cubs call up Kenny Hubbs. He's 21 years old. Uh, at the time, their second baseman is Don Zimmer, who is actually an all-star second baseman. But Ken Hubbs, he's a future. He makes his debut September 10th against the Phillies that year. He and Lou Brock debut on the same day. Lou Brock is a Cubs center fielder, and Kenny Hubbs is playing second base. And against the Phillies, September 10th, Kenny Hubbs goes 2 for 3 with an RBI. And you have Brock and Hubbs, the future of the Chicago Cubs, for a little while. Anyway, Kenny Hubbs plays 10 games as a rookie. 1962 arrives, and we have this thing called the expansion draft in baseball. And Don Zimmer, the Cubs second baseman, is taken by the Mets in the expansion draft. And now there's a wide open spot for Kenny Hubbs to start at second base for the Chicago Cubs. And the 1962 Chicago Cubs blow. Like, they suck. They're not good. They finish in ninth place. They're a miserable squad. But Kenny Hubbs is legit. He hits 260 as a rookie. Fine. 172 hits, 5 homers, 49 RBIs. He leads all rookies in games, in hits, in doubles, and triples, and runs. On April 17th of that year, he was 5 for 5 with 2 home runs against the Pirates. During the season, Phil Wrigley, the owner of the Cubs, literally takes Kenny Hubbs' contract, tears it up in front of him, and doubles his salary. And at the end of the 62 season, Kenny Hubbs is the National League Rookie of the Year. He gets 19 out of 20 first place votes. This is 1 year after Billy Williams won the Rookie of the Year for the Cubs. So the Cubs have this young nucleus of Kenny Hubbs, Billy Williams, Ernie Banks. Kenny Hubbs also that year sets a record. He goes 78 straight games without an error at second base. He wins a Gold Glove. Following season, 1963, Kenny Hubbs only hits 235, but he plays great defense. The Cubs are 82 and 80, and Kenny Hubbs is 21 years old. And there's something interesting that happens to Kenny Hubbs. At the time, commercial aviation wasn't what it is now. And this is going to sound weird and technical and stupid, but basically, instead of flying above weather, planes oftentimes would fly below weather. So you're the Cubs and you're on your flight and you're flying to Philadelphia and your plane is shaking a lot. You're going out west. Your plane is shaking a lot. It was a different time for flying. And Kenny Hubbs was terrified of flying. He hated flying. He was a soaked hands on the seat back like this. He was a devout Mormon, so just praying and on the plane and freaking the fuck out about flying. So he decided to do something really interesting that I can actually admire. In 1963, Kenny Hubbs decides he's going to take flying lessons. And throughout spring training 1963, he's taking lessons how to fly an airplane. And I have to say, from a personal situation, I used to be really, really terrified of heights. And about 15 years ago, I decided to skydive with my sister-in-law and my 2 sister-in-laws. And it was terrifying. Like, fighting your fear and confronting something that you were genuinely, legitimately, physically afraid of is no joke. And I still remember jumping out of the plane, spinning backwards out of the plane, thinking I'm going to die, and then floating down to earth gently as the parachute expands and feeling this sigh of relief. Like, I've conquered my fear. This was my biggest fear and I've conquered it. And to show you it's my biggest fear, my hands are literally sweaty right now, even talking about skydiving. But I did approach and conquer my fear. And that's really what Kenny Hubbs is doing, is he decided to face my fear. I'm going to learn to fly. And what happened is he learned to not only fly, he learned to love flying. And he actually bought his own plane and just found it this passion. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to fly. I'm going to fly here and there. And I'm going to be amazing. And the Cubs were not happy about this. The Cubs did not feel great about their future star owning a plane, flying a plane, making it his life. But Kenny Hubbs was like, this is who I am. I'm not just a baseball player. I'm not just a Mormon. I'm not just a quiet guy who wants to play a few. I want to fly. And what happened next is one of the great tragedies in sports. Hey, if you're a fan of the Press Box Chronicles, you know that we are a weekly YouTube show. You know that we have clips all across social media, from TikTok and Instagram to all the things. But we also have something special. Wait for it. We have merch. We got shirts, we got hoodies, and we have hats. If you go to the link in the description, you can order them now, and you too can proudly wear the emblem of Press Box Chronicles. So it's February of 1964, and I think a pretty strong argument can be made that there are few people happier in America than Chicago Cubs second baseman Kenny Hubbs. First of all, you're the second baseman for the Chicago Cubs. You look around at your teammates. There's Ron Santo. There's Billy Williams. There's Ernie Banks. You're playing in Wrigley Field. Your dream from the time you were a kid was to play professional sports. And now you are the second baseman for the Chicago Cubs, one of the marquee franchises in baseball. And even better, you have overcome your greatest fear, flying and heights. And not only that, you now own a Cessna 172. And in the early months of 1964, Ken Hubbs officially earned his pilot's license where he could fly by himself. And now it's February 12th, 1964, and spring training is about to start. Another year in your career. You're expected to be an all-star. The Cubs are going to be really good. And you're just happy. And you have a best friend named Dennis Doyle. And Dennis Doyle was your best friend dating back to boyhood. You were the best man in his wedding in 1963 at the Salt Lake Temple, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Dennis Doyle is a student at BYU with a young child, and he's working toward his degree in physical education. He was working as a swim instructor. This is your boy. And you and Dennis Doyle are going to fly to Utah to visit Dennis Doyle's family. And you do that. And you fly to Utah, and you're there, and you visit Dennis Doyle's wife, and you're there with his family. It's a surprise visit. You stay overnight. And the next day, you decide you're going to fly from Utah back to Colton, California. And your plane takes off at 10 o'clock in the morning. And there's weather, bad weather. But you are a new pilot and you don't know that much. And you take off and there's a snowstorm in Utah that's spreading. And you don't really have the wherewithal to know that you shouldn't be flying. And you're in the plane and you try making radio contact. You're literally Ken Hubbs flying your plane with the field shortly after takeoff, but your radio is on the wrong frequency. And you can't hear requests from the airport. And the airport is trying to tell you, there's a storm, worry about the storm, there's a storm. But you don't know any of this. And early on in your flight, you hit bad weather and you try turning around. You actually try turning your plane back. And somehow it doesn't work. And in your flight, you lose control of your airplane. And I always think, I'm actually being serious about this. I think about this a lot. I think too often we think about death, and maybe it's a survival mechanism, and we think about something like a plane crash, and we don't actually think what it had to be like to be Ken Hubbs, to be his friend Dennis Doyle, and you're in this plane by yourself, and you're a new pilot, and you're hitting bad weather, and you're not getting radio frequency from the airport, and you just don't know what to do. And the plane ended up crashing into a frozen lake, Lake Utah. And only later, when they sent out divers, did they discover the bodies of Ken Hubbs and Dennis Doyle at the bottom of this frozen lake. And in a lot of ways, it was Thurman Munson before Thurman Munson. And it was this young, hopeful baseball player who really represented something for his hometown community of Colton, California. He was sort of hope. And he was the golden child and the kid who was going to make it. And the kid who symbolized something great about sports and athleticism and faith and Mormonism and everything. And for the Cubs, he was their future star, one of many. He was a bright future. And all of a sudden, because of bad weather, because of an inexperienced pilot, because of circumstance and happenstance, it all came to an end. And Ken Hubbs, at age 22, was dead. So in the aftermath of the plane crash that took the life of Ken Hubbs, as well as Dennis Doyle, there was a lot of sort of trying to figure out what happened, a lot of investigative work, a lot of digging. And what was determined that this was mostly the product of an inexperienced pilot not really knowing how to deal with adverse conditions. And an article in the Salt Lake newspaper called Hubbs a comparatively inexperienced pilot who lost the horizon in the storm. And even though he had more than 100 hours of flying time, that is not a lot of flying time for a pilot to deal with this sort of weather. And I found an article from February 21st, 1964, Ken Hubbs given hero's funeral. And I just want to read a little bit about it. It said, Ken Hubbs was given a hero's funeral Thursday. But that won't be Colton's final tribute to the young baseball star who perished last week in an airplane crash. The 22-year-old second baseman of the Cubs was buried at Montecito Memorial Park after the biggest funeral in Colton's history. An overflow crowd, estimated at 1,350 people, attended Mormon services in the auditorium of Colton High School, where Hubbs was a four-sport letterman and student body president. Police said the procession to the cemetery was more than a mile long. It took 20 minutes to pass the main intersection downtown. The nearby city of San Bernardino sent most of its police force to help Colton officers manage the traffic. Bishop Lyman Madsen of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints delivered one of 3 eulogies at the funeral. Ken's footprints, he said, are in solid rock. Time will never erase his memory. And I think it is a thing we do with loved ones, but especially with famous people, people who play second base for the Chicago Cubs, people who sing in famous bands, people who play guitar, people who act. We say they will never be forgotten. But I think for most people, sadly, the memory of Ken Hubbs has vanished. Time moves on. We talk about different people. We think about different sporting events. We look at a list of past Rookie of the Years and we skim past Ken Hubbs' name, just as we skim past Joe Charbonneau's name. Like time marches on. But I think every so often, even if every once in a while, it's important to look back and think about a Thurman Munson, think about a Mike Darr, think about a Darryl Kyle, and think about a Ken Hubbs, and think about the lives lost, the athletes who entertained us, the athletes who could have been, should have been, were going to be great, but somehow, because of some quirk in life, because of some tragedy, because of some misjudgment, because of some moment in time, they are lost, not just to our games, but sadly to our memories. That is a wrap for this episode of Press Box Chronicles with Jeff Pearlman. Please leave a comment below on what stories you'd like to hear more about, or if there's a particular sports figure who interests you. Please make sure you like and subscribe and follow me on TikTok at Jeff Pearlman Author and Bluesky at Jeff Pearlman. Thank you for diving behind the scenes and digging into the story. We'll see you next time on Press Box Chronicles.